Hello, I'm Bart Schultz, the Director of the Civic Knowledge Project at the University of Chicago. The Civic Knowledge Project is committed to fostering stronger community connections between the University of Chicago and its surrounding community. As part of our work, we're trying to produce some videos featuring some of the legendary figures of Hyde Park and the South Side. And today, we're honored to be here with Mr. Leon Despres, the legendary Chicago Alderman for the 5th Ward. Mr. Dupre has written a book about his experiences called Challenging the Daley Machine, a Chicago Alderman's memoir. And in the introduction to that book, the preface to that book introduces him in the following terms. The people of the 5th Ward who had elected him their representative re-elected him 4 times until he chose not to run again. A fellow independent alderman, William Cousins, said of him in a Hyde Park Herald article at the time of his retirement, "He has a great sensitivity to human needs and is a person with the utmost concern for the protection of civil rights of all persons. He spoke particularly for those who are at the greatest disadvantage and who have suffered the greatest deprivation." Mr. Dupre was not only an alderman, he was also the city's parliamentarian under Mayor Jane Byrne and Mayor Harold Washington. He's been an outstanding defender of the architectural treasures of Chicago. I can't think of any individual living to whom the city owes more. We're delighted to be here with you, Mr. Dupre.
Thank you. That's very generous of you. I enjoyed every word.
I wonder if we could begin by inviting you to reminisce about the city as you've known it, growing up here, spending 100 years on the south side of Chicago.
Well, when I was born, my parents lived at 41st and Michigan Avenue. But when I was 3 years old, they moved to Hyde Park as the original tenants in an apartment building. And I've lived in Hyde Park ever since. That's 97 years. The first 3 years I can't be responsible for.
And in your book, you speak so glowingly of the south side of Chicago. At one point you remark, "I felt forever indebted to Paul Cornell, who founded Hyde Park in 1856 and laid it out as an independent village. He took full advantage of its geographical asset as a self-contained lakefront community, adorned it with magnificent parks, and connected it to the central city by extraordinary transportation facilities. It was annexed by Chicago in 1889. I'm still in love with Hyde Park and all Paul Cornell did to make it possible." Why is your love for Hyde Park so strong?
Well, when I was alderman, the area I represented included Hyde Park from 51st, that is Hyde Park Boulevard, to 63rd Street, and from Cottage Grove Avenue to the lake. That's the area that was included in the original Hyde Park Village, although the village also extended all the way to the state line. And Hyde Park is not a utopia, but thanks to the presence of the university and its location and the attraction Hyde Park offers to intellectual activity, it has a somewhat higher standard of ethics and of selflessness and of political generosity than other sections of the city. I'm very fortunate that in 1911, when I was 3 years old, my family moved from 42nd and Michigan to Hyde Park, where I've lived ever since. That's more than 97 years. And I find the neighborhood fascinating, interesting, variegated, and a wonderful place to live.
Well, it's been wonderful for Hyde Park to have you as the spokesperson for this part of the city for so many years. In your book, you describe walking down 55th Street in the early part of the 20th century, and you comment that you didn't realize it at the time, but that was the precursor to the modern shopping mall. Well, why did you write that line?
Well, 55th Street was a tremendously interesting street. So was 63rd Street. Each of the streets from the lake or near the lake to Cottage Grove was lined with retail establishments of all kinds, establishments satisfying the physical needs of the residents, bakeries, meat shops, grocery shops, dry goods stores, and a whole variety of miscellaneous enterprises. Each of the streets was thriving, bustling, and active. And one can't wish for the return of that activity because modern transportation and commerce demand a different kind of distribution, but it was exciting. It was interesting to go by, and as 55th Street decayed, the very decay was constructive in that the vacant stores became hosts to all kinds of enterprises. The Compass Players fastened in 55th Street. Some other dramatic groups fastened there. It was possible to rent a store for some kind of bona fide nonprofit activity, and the street was still very interesting in its decay. But finally, when urban renewal came, the planners in charge of urban renewal decided on the utter destruction of 55th Street as a shopping area and its replacement by a shopping center. The shopping center is interesting, but it doesn't have the variety of the old 55th Street. I don't wish the old street back, but I relish the memory of it.
Was there a favorite period of yours for Hyde Park?
No, it's all favorite. Really, it's as good now as it's ever been. It's very exciting. In a way, the community has proved itself, and after spawning all kinds of public officials, it may even be spawning a president of the United States. You can't ask for much more. And the community is interesting. I worry that there are too many high-rises projected, and that high-rises may make Hyde Park seem like North Lakeshore Drive. But I may not live to see that transformation. So I am extremely well satisfied with the community as I have known it in my lifetime.
Well, we're getting a little traffic noise from the community now. I should explain, we're sitting here in Mr. Dupre's apartment in Vista Homes, looking out over Jackson Park and the Museum of Science and Industry, this fabulous vista that has meant so much to you here for some time. Jackson Park was your favorite park growing up, is that right?
Certainly. The first photograph of me was taken lying in Jackson Park with my grandmother by my side. And looking out the front window now at 100 plus, I can see the area where my first photograph was taken in 1908. And I think that's amazing.
It is. It is. And you've been a supporter of the park. You were a bird watcher as well, is that right?
Well, I was a bird watcher, although not a very good one. I attended Douglas's first bird watching tour of Jackson Park, which he has kept up for nearly 30 years.
Now this is Doug Anderson.
Doug Anderson, yeah. I'm fanatically devoted to the parks. I think they are the valuable breathing space of the city. And when I ceased occupying public office, I promptly joined the board of directors of Friends of the Parks because I wanted to do whatever I could to support and enhance the parks of Chicago. They're a wonderful asset. I feel I owe a great deal to Jackson Park because I've lived next to it from childhood on, but I'm also devoted to the other parks.
Do you think of yourself as, in some ways, an environmentalist? You have this passion for the green spaces of Chicago and for maintaining the city's beautiful spaces.
Well, I hadn't thought of myself as an environmentalist until now. When you ask me, maybe I am. Like the bourgeois gentilhomme, my father and my mother, why did you never tell me that I was an environmentalist?
Well, I think it comes through in your book, your love of the open spaces of the urban ecology.
Well, we're so grateful that they were set apart. And it's so important that we try to get more. I think it's a wonderful thing that the city bought the South Shore Country Club, for example, and preserved that area along the lake. And then there are other park areas, potential park areas along the lake, about 4 or 6 miles, that should be acquired.
Do you think of this? You were, of course, instrumental in getting the city to develop a system for granting landmark status to so many of its architectural treasures. And I assume you think of the park system and the buildings around here as part of that legacy, as part of the architecture that needs to be preserved.
Well, it's part of the urban landscape that needs to be preserved. It's very important. I'm horrified. Well, maybe that's too inaccurate a word. I'm appalled at the mayor's offer of the great field in Washington Park for Olympic Games in 2016. And I say humorously that in 2016, if they take that portion of Washington Park, I will boycott the Olympic Games. And I'm sure I will not attend. But
well, I hope City Hall has learned not to underestimate you. I look forward to seeing you there. But you do feel strongly about the Olympics and the proposed Olympics.
Well, the Olympics are all right, but not taking Washington Park. I've seen the remnant of the Olympics in Athens. There's a great big underused stadium in the middle of the city. I don't know what it destroyed. I saw the Olympic Games in Paris in 1924, and when the games are over, there's no planning for the improvement of the city. And the mayor and the business committee in charge of trying to get the games for Chicago look only at the financial possibilities. In 2016, a mayor who's interested in getting the games should be dependent on a group to plan the games, not to take away parks, and another group that plans what will happen to the city after the games. Neither of those events is occurring, and consequently, I hope that Chicago does not get the Olympic Games, because as conceived, they will injure the city in the long run.
Yes, I understand. Do you feel the current Mayor Daley is in some ways too like his father, whom you knew quite well?
Well, he doesn't have nearly the power that his father had. His father was primarily chairman of the Democratic Party of Cook County, and in that capacity, at the height of his influence, he had more than 35,000 patronage jobs, which he was able to allocate among the ward and county committeemen, and which he used as a political army to bring the party back into power. I know because I had to fight that army in the 5th Ward. And in his capacity as dispenser of patronage, he had to run for mayor because he couldn't afford to let anyone else be mayor and attack him. This mayor does not have that kind of patronage power. By law, he has about 2,000 jobs. By cheating, he has kept up as much patronage as he could, but his assistants have been convicted, and he's probably being steadily reduced to 2,000 jobs. As a result, he has to govern like an executive. He can't govern like a political czar, as his father did, much as he wishes he could. And so he's actually a much better mayor than his father, not because his character is different, but because the objective events surrounding the mayoralty are now so different.
And you would count that as progress in politics?
Well, it makes for a better city. For example, he likes trees, and so we have wonderful trees. He likes flowers, and so he emphasizes flowers. He has a feeling for the lakefront, and so he saved Northerly Island, that's the former Meigs Field, when his father supported the airfield there year after year. And he's done a lot of other things that his father couldn't have done. But at the same time, he's willing to destroy the great field of Washington Park and most of Washington Park itself. He supported the stadium on the lake. It sold and destroyed the authenticity of Chicago, of Soldier Field. And he, I'd say because of objective conditions, he's a much better mayor than his father, although if he had the same power his father had, he'd be quite similar. But he doesn't have, and so he'll retire with a better record and a better reputation.
Well, I'm sure no one has done more to vitalize the democratic process in Chicago than you. And given that you feel the mayor is, the machine politics is a little more under control nowadays, do you feel more positive about young people seeking political careers?
Certainly, but it's a lot of work. There are lots of people who make a living off politics and who form the Democratic Party and also the Republican Party. When you make a living off politics, you support it strongly, and you have to be beaten in an election to be replaced. And we still have plenty of professional politicians, even though we don't have a massive machine of the kind we had under the old man.
I wonder if at this point, I mean, I have here a guest, a student from the University of Chicago, an undergraduate named Charlotte, who would like to talk to you a little more about your political activities and some of the themes you've touched on concerning urban renewal. So would it be all right if I got Charlotte up here to talk with you for a while? And then
Certainly.
I'd like to return and ask you a few more philosophical questions. I'm very intrigued by your views about power and democracy and about your intellectual stance on politics. I'd like to hear about your favorite authors and sources of inspiration. So I'll bring Charlotte up now, and she's done a little research on the university and urban renewal. She'd like to talk to you about that.
Good.
And I'll be back. Thank you so much.
I'm Charlotte Crinteris. I'm an undergraduate at the University of Chicago and an intern at the Civic Knowledge Project. And Mr. Dupre, I wanted to ask you a few questions about your political life.
Certainly.
You were elected as an independent Democrat to City Council, and I wonder what it meant to be an independent Democrat during the years of the machine.
Well, it was difficult because the machine was in the business of politics. You know, Richard Daley opted to go into politics to earn a living. And so he and the other active members of the machine viewed that as a living and something that shouldn't be touched. They had ideas too, but primarily they were interested in it as a livelihood. So I was confronting people whose livelihood was threatened. And for that reason, my first two elections, I had very, very lively fights and had great difficulty being elected. The third, fourth, and fifth time, they gave up on me. It was just too much effort, and they tolerated my presence. Now, the difference was that I was a liberal in political thinking and activity, and they were perfectly willing to support such people if they were in offices that didn't threaten their livelihood, and especially if they were good crowd stimulators, like Paul Douglas and Adlai Stevenson and Franklin Roosevelt, men who had strong liberal democratic feelings, but who didn't threaten the livelihood of the underlying machine.
You mentioned that your re-election battles for the first, or your election and re-election battles were very difficult, but I wonder what your daily relations with your Democratic colleagues were like. Were they difficult, or?
Oh, well, they were friendly. I do mention what happened at the first business session. When one of the machine aldermen leaned over, he sat behind me in the city council, and he said, "You saw what we did to Alderman Merriam, and we'll do the same thing to you if you behave that way," leaving no doubt as to their intention. But personally, they were nearly all quite friendly, and I cultivated friendly personal relations, at least the absence of unfriendly personal relations. The only alderman with whom I had a really unfriendly personal relationship was Alderman Marzullo. In an earlier aldermanic campaign, as chairman, as political action chairman of the Illinois voters of Illinois, independent voters of Illinois, I kind of managed or headed a campaign to oppose him for alderman. And we carried one precinct on the west side. It was an experiment on our part. It was well worthwhile, and we were pleased to carry one precinct. But for him, that was like murder. One precinct lost. You see, before the election, Daley would call in the committeemen and say, "How are you doing?" And undoubtedly he said, "Don't worry, Mr. Mayor, we have every precinct covered. We'll carry every precinct." And then it turned out there was one precinct he didn't carry. and he was not giving an accurate picture to his chief. And he never forgave me of that. Really, years after, in the city council, he was elected also. He would talk to me about it. He said, somebody lied to me. And I think he blamed me for it. So my relationship, my personal relationship was good, except with Alderman Marzullo.
In your book, you describe some pretty dirty tricks they would play on you in council meetings, raising points of order during your speaking time and cutting off your microphone. And you even describe Mayor Daley calling you a liar once. But yet you say, even with Mayor Daley, you had friendly personal relations. How is it possible to maintain that given the kind of political opposition you were up against?
Well, I had to tolerate it. I learned that they had control of the microphones, and I had to use the first 2 minutes to say everything I had to say. The rules were an alderman is limited to 10 minutes. If you were a machine alderman, you could talk longer than 10 minutes if it did you any good. But it was a meaningless rule as far as I was concerned, because the machine knew that my words were being carried on television, and they wanted to cut me off as rapidly as possible. So the longest time I ever had was 2 minutes after I realized that I wouldn't get any more time and that the rule was meaningless about 10 minutes, I adjusted my remarks and concentrated them. And we had agreeable personal relations. I even had friendly relations with a couple of machine aldermen, especially at the beginning, before they became used to the fact that I was an outlaw.
Were there any allies you had, Republicans?
Well, there were, in my first session as alderman, there were 6 or 7 Republicans, of whom 3 or 4 were allies, and 3 or 4, although Republicans, were secretly allies of the machine. After the first election, there were just 2 Republicans elected, and they were allies on questions of freedom of speech, that is, freedom of speech for aldermen, but they were not allies on the basic question of segregation and discrimination. They came from wards that elected them on the basis of being anti-black.
So the Republican Party at this time had no organization comparable to the Daley machine?
Oh, no, they had 2 aldermen out of 50. That's no organization. I mean, that doesn't reflect any organization. It's there, it remains. They have nominal committeemen, and if there's a big shift nationally, if a Bush is elected, they might elect a few more aldermen, but Chicago is a Democratic city, and now you see that Illinois is an Obama state.
Do you think that Obama's popularity or politics are related to the Democratic politics of
Well, they're delighted with Obama. He's like Paul Douglas as senator or Adlai Stevenson as governor. He can have whatever ideas he wants. A machine politician looks on Obama as a gift from heaven, a popular candidate who will sweep in the recorder of deeds and every other candidate they want to have elected.
Robert Merriam, who was the Fifth Ward alderman before you, switched parties to run for mayor in 1955. Did you ever think about switching parties?
No. Well, you know, in the first election, I had the support of the Republican organization in the Fifth Ward. It was a minority organization with a few good precincts and a skillful ward committeeman. And I was a little uncomfortable about getting the support, but I was glad to have it. And I'm sure it was crucial in a tight election.
I also wanted to ask you a little bit about your relations with the university during your time. Who were the primary people at the university that you interacted with and dealt with?
Well, my direct contact with the university was with the legal counsel for the university. I've forgotten him. But at nearly every meeting of the city council, he had measures that the university wanted to have passed. Clearing of streets, clearing of alleys, technical measures. And on everyone, I was very cooperative with him. And he told me that I was by far the most accommodating and the best alderman they had ever had. But that didn't do me any good, because when we came to the deepest social issues, the university business side was different from the academic side. See, I have tremendous loyalty to the university, from kindergarten, lab school, college, law school, and neighborliness. But the business side is different. You know, the academic side was very good on race relations. The business side took the leadership in racial covenants to plaster Hyde Park with covenants agreeing not to allow sale or occupancy by African Americans. And they defined an African American as a person with 1/8 African ancestry. So that side of the university, the business side, was really hostile to me, while the academic side was the source of my strongest popular support. I mean, I say academic, I should say intellectual side.
I read a little bit of the university correspondence between you and the university, and also some internal memos concerning your tenure as alderman. And during your re-election in 1959, they circulated some memos amongst themselves saying that they were being asked to take a position either for you or for your opposition, and that they were going to refuse to do this because it was not proper for them to have a political position or be a political advocate. Do you think that was disingenuous, or is it true that they mostly stayed out of politics?
It was disingenuous because they gave powerful support to my opposition. I had an interesting experience the second time. You see, the first time I ran, the committeeman Barnett Hodes, Hodes, ran a precinct captain, and they had no trouble being hands off because they didn't want to support me, they didn't want to antagonize the machine, and the machine didn't offer a candidate who attracted them. But on the second round, they became disillusioned with me, that is, the business side did. And Julian Levy arranged with Barnett Hodes, the Democratic ward committeeman, to give him full support, to get him the support of the newspapers, to get him as much as he could of the law faculty and the medical faculty, the conservatives in the university. And that was Barnett Hodes' dream come true, that the university would support his nominee. So he felt confident of victory. In fact, overconfident, and he chose as candidate his nephew, Alan Dropkin. And Julian Levy kept to his promise. The newspapers supported Dropkin, except the Daily News, and the law faculty, the medical faculty, and some conservatives went on his committee and supported him. And I had a very tough fight. I want to tell you an anecdote. Barnett Hodes, the Democratic Fifth Ward committeeman, was complained to about running his nephew as alderman, and he said, "Why, I had nothing to do with it. A committee came to me consisting of Joseph Pinkert, who was a close friend, and several others, and they said to me, we have a bright young man who would be a good candidate for alderman." And I said, "Who is it?" And they said, "Alan Dropkin." Now, Alan Dropkin happens to be my nephew, but I said to the committee, "All right, then we'll run Alan Dropkin." Of course, that wasn't what really happened, but that was the story he gave. It was the realization of his dream to have the university influence on his side, and therefore, filled with overconfidence, he ran his nephew, and that gave me the election. But it was a very tough fight. My wife said she would not go through another one like it. I wondered what I would do, but there never was another one like it.
How much do you think the people of Hyde Park believed that anecdote that he told, or sort of the lies that the machine published about itself?
Well, it just wasn't credible, because Dropkin was a very poor candidate, very poor. We had a meeting sponsored by the League of Women Voters during the campaign, attended by 600 people. Now, you couldn't have that today, but During that meeting, each candidate spoke, and then the candidates answered questions. And Dropkin was asked what he had a sympathetic crowd, but he was asked, what would you do about this measure, this problem? And he said, well, I would consult my committee and be guided by what they said. Then they asked him about some other important measure, and he said, well, I would consult my committee and be guided by what they said. Then a third question asked him about something very important, and he gave the same answer, and the crowd laughed. And that was the end of Alan Dropkin.
Did he ever run again for anything?
No.
Learned his lesson?
Well, he was a successful lawyer. I saw him after, and he was very friendly. He said, the best thing you did was beat me. I'm glad I wasn't alderman. He meant that he made a lot of money, and he would have made it as alderman too.
You mentioned Barnett Hodes, who was the committeeman for the 5th Ward.
Yes.
I noticed in some of the correspondence that I was reading that there were letters that you and Hodes had co-signed about local interest of maybe maintenance of streets or something like this. So you worked with him on local issues.
About what?
Local issues about the maintenance of maybe streets or about maintaining
I
property.
suppose I would. He invited me to a meeting of the 5th Ward Democratic Organization. He would have been glad to have me join the organization, but then I would have been bound by support of him and of Daley, and I never chose to join. And in my second election, the victory was so startling that he had to resign as ward committeeman, and Marshall Korshak was appointed in his stead and stayed on as long as I was alderman.
What happened to your relations with the University of Chicago after the 1959 election?
Well, they were very good. Very good. But I often had trouble with the real estate office. You know, when George, what's his name? George Beadle.
Yeah.
We were very friendly.
You knew Hutchins.
No, I didn't know Hutchins. Hutchins came in when I graduated from law school. He gave me my diploma, and I remember his reading Leon Despres, in a beautiful voice. But that was my major contact with him. I met him a few days earlier.
I wanted to ask you just one last question. In your book, there's a picture of you in Jackson Park reading something in commemoration of Clarence Darrow, and you mentioned that you knew him personally. And I actually saw a book on your coffee table of his writings, and I was wondering, how did you know him?
Well, of course, I admired Clarence Darrow very much. He was a neighbor. He lived on 60th Street, a little west of Stony Island, in a building that's now been destroyed. The first time I saw him was on a Sunday afternoon. It's hard to imagine now, but there used to be lectures given in downtown theaters for pay by people like Clarence Darrow, and he was a lawyer, but he would earn a living by lecturing or debating on Sunday afternoon. And then In 1935, Paul Douglas asked me to run for alderman. Well, I was very flattered, but I was then, from 33 to 37, a member of the Socialist Party of America, and I had committed myself to manage an aldermanic campaign for a candidate named Herman Burt. And so I had to decline, but I was very flattered that Paul Douglas asked me. He went on with his campaign, and in managing the campaign of Herman Burt, I went to Clarence Darrow and asked him to support the socialist candidate, Herman Burt. And Darrow told me, "I'm sorry, I've already promised Paul Douglas to support his candidate." So that was my only visit to Clarence Darrow in his home on the 6th or 7th floor of this building on 60th Street. And then I saw him again at a dinner I chaired for the League of Industrial Democracy. So I saw him at least 3 or 4 times. I wouldn't say I knew him, but of course I admired him. I admired him especially for what he did in the Loeb Leopold case.
Well, thank you very much for answering my questions.
Sure.
I was hoping at this point to pick up from where Charlotte left off and ask you about some of the intellectual and philosophical themes that have dominated your life. You've known so many people. You were just talking about Clarence Darrow. Earlier you mentioned that Saul Alinsky was a neighbor back when you lived in this building that I now occupy. I was delighted to learn that Mr. Dupre and I shared a common address, 5525 South Blackstone. Saul Alinsky was a neighbor there. You've known so many figures on the South Side that I can't help but ask which intellectual company you sought out and found the most stimulating. Did you gravitate to the architects, the historians, the legal circles?
I really can't answer that. I'd have to think about it and try to remember.
Yes, you knew Nelson Algren, Saul Bellow.
Well, I knew Nelson Algren pretty well. I knew Saul Bellow. Saul Alinsky and I were friends, and our wives were very good friends. Saul Alinsky and I had a Hyde Park experience together. I think I was then in the Socialist Party. And he and I decided we should be prepared for the revolution and know how to operate a gun. So we went to the Hyde Park YMCA at 53rd and Dorchester. In the basement they had a shooting range, and they had an instructor who would give you instructions. And I took it seriously. Worked hard on the gun. Followed his instructions, and and I did extremely well. And he said, "You have a wonderful sight for a gun. You'll do very well. You'll do very well." Encouraging me to come back. Saul took his gun, and didn't bother with that. Just fired four shots. He was excited. And we never went back. We weren't serious. We weren't serious. Well, we thought we were serious about it, but we weren't. And my special experience with Saul Alinsky. But we had a middle class association.
I was intrigued by your remark that you were preparing for the revolution. Is that you were going to practice marksmanship because you thought a violent revolution was likely?
I guess that's what we thought. We thought it was coming. Saul Alinsky leaned toward the CP, the Stalinists, the Communist Party. He never joined it, but he leaned toward them. He told me that he was talking to young men who were preparing to go to Spain. So he was close to them. I hated the CP and Stalin. And then after 4 years, I left the Socialist Party, and my activities were in the field of labor and civil liberties. You know, the Civil Liberties Union of New York disfranchised the local branch of the ACLU and formed a new one, the Illinois Division, and asked me to join, and I became vice chairman and attorney. And so from 48, that didn't happen until 48 to 55, I was counsel to the ACLU, and all that kind of writing influenced me. Writing in behalf of civil liberties, writing in behalf of freedom, but I can't now tell you who influenced me.
Have you had over the years favorite authors, philosophical or literary?
Well, certainly literary I mean, the greatest literary authors are Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. Just wonderful. Just to mention their names excites me. They're so good. But they're not the only ones. But I would name them as the ones who are most interesting.
Have you been influenced by the Chicago school much? Nelson Algren as a writer, or Dreiser? Or
I admired him as a writer. I admired Dreiser and liked him very much. Sure. I guess I'm eclectic, but I have to tell you that I veer toward the literature of revolt.
There's that wonderful picture in your book of you walking down a Chicago alley with the French philosopher, writer Jean-Paul Sartre. And as we were saying earlier, there's no explanation in your book. Would you mind filling in that?
Well, after the war, the State Department financed trips to the U.S. by intellectual leaders of various kinds, labor leaders, strategically placed individuals, and Roosevelt University Labor Division was in charge of their Chicago programs, and they would call me, especially if the group was French-speaking, and they called me to meet a group of 3 or 4, which included the author. And so I took them to see the African-American settlement, the Black Ghetto, and we walked through the alleys. It was a great eye-opener to them.
But Sartre's writings weren't particularly influential.
No, on the contrary.
Yeah.
Sartre was not influential at all. In politics, I think the writer whom I admired the most was Trotsky. But that's in limited political analysis about countries and international rivalries and the inevitability of capitalistic conflict. I think in that field, he was the most influential writer, clear and perceptive.
After so many years in politics, Chicago politics, where you've seen so much pettiness and venality, you discovered 19 years into your career as alderman that Mayor Daley had been having the police follow you and keep a file on you. Given that experience, do you hang on to some of the Trotskyite or socialist hopes for a changed human nature?
Well, they're very modified and reduced now. Certainly I hang on to them and wish that society could change in that direction. But my utopianism is very limited. I don't expect utopia. I expect something much better than we have. But I'd be willing to settle for a good Obama, and I'm not sure how good Obama is, but I'm still enthusiastic for him, even though I expect disappointments.
And why do you say that?
Well, because our society is very tough. For example, I could never have been elected alderman of the 5th Ward if I had said I don't believe in a personal God. If I had said that, I would have been defeated. Or if I had said I believe in fighting for socialism, I would have been defeated. I didn't believe in the inevitability of socialism, which I had adopted much, much earlier. And I wasn't prepared to say outright that there was no personal God, but I was pretty close to it. I couldn't say outright, I don't know, I'm an agnostic or something like that, and I would have been defeated. So you have to conform, and Obama has to conform in many more ways, like his position on offshore drilling. What a terrible thing. We shouldn't do any more offshore drilling. We should preserve the planet. And because he knows he has to say it or not be elected, he says, yes, I've changed my mind. I'm for offshore dwelling. I think he's still a wonderful candidate and will appoint very capable people. But he's no utopian, and neither am I, except in my innermost desires.
I still think you deserve the designation of environmentalist.
Okay. Well, I'll
Those
be glad.
themes are clearly
Thank you.
important to you, and it's very interesting hearing you address them. I wonder if I could press you a little bit more on the religious issue, though. Have you changed your views on religion?
No, I've remained a member of a KAM congregation. I just feel I have a rich heritage, and I'm very fortunate to be born a member of a remarkable minority. Just about 15 million people in a whole planet of several billion, but with a very interesting past. But when I go to services, I'm appalled by the responsive readings. You know, the congregation appeals to God because of all the wonderful things He has done for us.
Well, we were interrupted by a gust of wind, but we are at one in agreeing that it wasn't from the Almighty. And Mr. Dupre was just explaining that your religion is more of a social commitment. It's not a metaphysical or theological commitment to belief in a personal God. Or
I guess you could say that. It's a traditional loyalty. I pay a lot of money every year to meet my dues, and I'm very pleased to be a member of a group.
Perhaps you could actually mention that story about Clarence Darrow, since we were talking about him. He was also very skeptical, of course, about religious claims. But what is the story? Why do people meet out on the bridge on his birthday?
Well, he spoke to a spiritualist, and he said, I don't believe in spiritualism, but if there is anything to it, I want you to agree to meet me at 10 o'clock in the morning on my birthday after I die. So Arthur, well, I'm blocking on his name, who had made a study of Darrow's work and written a biography of him, decided to hold a meeting at that bridge, the place designated by Darrow. See, Darrow was on the 7th floor of an apartment building, and he could look out and see the bridge. And he said, this is the most beautiful place in the world. He was overstating it, but that's why he chose the bridge as the place he would go to at 10 o'clock in the morning on his birthday after his death. And Arthur picked up on that and decided to have a group meet there. And the group has met there, and I have met with them for more than 50 years. We have about 150 people, and we have brief remarks about Darrow at the bridge. And then we adjourn to the museum and have coffee and delicious cupcakes and listen to a speaker, a very good speaker. And I'm very pleased to see Darrow's memory have such a tangible recognition years after his death.
It's a wonderful tradition.
Of course, he's never appeared.
I thought some people had claimed that they'd communicated.
Well, sure, they do. People, you know, that wind that blew open the shutter reminded me of it. If they get a wind, they say, Darrow's here.
Well, I'm very much counting on you to be at that 2016 Olympics to boycott it. But if you think, you know, in more sadly realistic terms about your future and what type of ceremony might commemorate Leon Despres, what type of tradition would you favor?
Well, I had a real estate developer approach me and ask me for permission to name a new apartment development after me, the Dupre Apartments. And I declined. I just didn't have any feeling for it. And I also declined on the practical ground that if there was any problem about electricity or anything else, tenants would call me. And so after that, I thought about it. I wrote a letter to the Hyde Park Herald reciting that this developer had come to me and saying that I didn't want anything named after me, except maybe, I said, a tomato or a rose. And Ron Grzywinski, South Shore Bank president, a neighbor saw it, and he has developed a tomato, the Dupre tomato. It's pretty good. It's just a fat tomato. And as far as I know, no one else read that letter in the Hyde Park Herald because no one mentioned it to me. But it fell on fertile ears, and now there's a Dupre tomato, and that satisfies me. It takes a while to develop it. I think this year he'll be able to give seeds to people so they can plant the tomato.
Well, that's such a wonderful idea. And I must say the Civic Knowledge Project, as part of its sustainability activities, is very interested in local and organic food. So we are going to have to help call attention to the Dupre tomato.
Yeah, that's right.
And popularize it on the South Side.
That's
I think
right.
we can also promise you that we'll try to develop a Civic Knowledge Project Dupre Rose. If you thought that was an appropriate idea. What was your favorite color?
Well, I said tomato or rose. And I'm well satisfied with a tomato. No need to bother with a rose.
Okay.
That's a lot of work. But, you know, I see businesses and enterprises named after people who give $100 million to the university, some who give it anonymously, and I admire those the most. You take Michael Reese Hospital, you know, it's about to be sold to a developer, and it's lasted more than 100 years. And I suppose Michael Reese, if he were living, would be pleased that his name had been repeated so many times, but it seems a form of unjustified egotism.
So it's more appropriate, perhaps, for people to pursue your ideals and continue the fight for
I think
equality
so.
and justice.
I was really breaking my commitment when I said I'd be glad to have a tomato or a rose named after me, because I really am pleased that there's a Dupre tomato, and especially if you succeed in growing some organically. That'd be wonderful.
Well, I don't want to get away from your answers. Interestingly, though, one of our projects is going to involve working with the Peggy Noteberg Nature Museum on a program called the Learning Lunchroom. They bring in school groups from all over the city and suburbs, and we want to offer them an educational meal that will feature local and organic food from the south side of Chicago. We want to offer them lunches for $1 so that students can afford it and order these lunches in advance. I think it would be wonderful if we could feature the Dupre tomato in that. It would be very educational and teach them a lot about the south side of Chicago.
Well, Ron Grzywinski lives on Kenwood Avenue. He's president of the South Shore Bank, and he would be glad to give you some seeds. And next year you can plant them, and it'd be nice if you included them in your lunch.
Well, we would like all future generations of Chicago school children to know about your work. And when you think about the educational system now, which was, of course, a big part of your concern as an alderman and so forth, I wonder, what do you hope to see? How do you think that the CPS can do what it needs to do for younger people?
Well, I'm very pleased with the present superintendent.
Arnie Duncan.
Yes, he's the best one we've had in a long, long time. I don't know if anybody was as good as he, but anyhow, he's very good. Well, I mean, school is a disturbing experience when you think we send people to school to learn them to become adjusted citizens. I'm sure we can do better, but I'm enthusiastic when I read about anyone who has creative ideas and who supports improvement in the public schools.
You think for too long they have been training adjusted citizens?
Well, that's their job, isn't it? Send the children to school for 12 years so they can operate in society. I'm sure the the conservatives have attacked the public schools and tried to make them produce more subservient graduates.
I think perhaps if more schools were like the University of Chicago and the Lab School, there would be less emphasis on
Well,
that.
that was certainly the best school I went to.
The Lab School?
Yes.
You remark in your book about how it insisted on originality and creativity.
That's right.
Which was different from the public school
You
system.
spoke about speaking.
Yes.
And I meant to tell you about that.
Please.
Well, when I went to Hyde Park High School for about 2 years, and I was very much interested in speaking, and I saw that there was a group called the Extemporaneous Speaking Society that met once a week and would speak on extemporaneously on issues given to the pupils, and they would talk and be graded. And I liked it very much, and I attended, and I was good enough at it so that I was on the school team, and I went to U High. We represented U High in a contest to see who would rate the best. And then I represented Hyde Park High School in the extemporaneous speaking team at the Board of Education citywide. All I remember about it was there was a blind boy who got first place, and later he and I served in the city council together. And then I joined the debating team. There wasn't much of a debating team, but I was excited about it, and I was on the debating team representing the high school, although I was only a junior, and I went to Englewood High School and we debated them. I think we lost. We debated the open shop versus the closed shop, and here I took the side of the open shop, which I denied later. But I mention that because my interest in speaking arose early, and I gave it experience early, and I achieved moderate success for a high school boy, and I'm sure it influenced my further development. I gave a talk recently on July 4th about the Treaty of Chicago in 1833. It was a short talk, about 8 minutes long, and I think it was the best talk I ever gave. I've never had so much reaction, so I've had tremendous experience in public speaking. After I became lawyer, I realized that on advice that I needed voice training, and I went to a voice teacher to improve my tonal ability. And public speaking, which started in the extemporaneous speaking class, has been a big part of my life, up to and including the last July 4th.
It contributed a great deal to your political career.
That's right. It certainly did. especially the ability that I developed in adult life to compress everything into 2 minutes.
And if you were talking to a group of, say, 6th or 7th graders in the schools today who had the opportunity to practice debate and public speaking, how would you explain its importance? Would you urge them to participate in these activities and perhaps give up some of their video time?
Well, I would emphasize that the ability to speak well and to speak to groups is a very important tool, very important, and that if they enjoy it, they should keep it up.
Surely this is also a considerable part of Senator Obama's success.
That's right. Well, he has a lot more going for him.
Well, if there's anything else that you would like to add, anything you would like to get on the record here, something you wish you'd said in your book, anything you'd like to add to your earlier comments in this session, please feel free to.
No, I volunteered that information about speaking in high school because I thought it was important. And then somehow I found the courage to talk for the downtrodden. I'll tell you one experience I had. I took a course with Professor Bernadette Schmidt, and he had a very tough assistant, and she returned our papers one day with terrible remarks, adverse remarks, and we were all furious about it. And I got up in class when Bernadette Schmidt finally arrived, and protested. And I'm embarrassed that I protested so poorly. I said to him, "Have you ever read Oliver Twist?" And I suppose he nodded. And I went on, I said, "Well, we want more soup." And he just shuffled his papers and began his lecture. And that really taught me a great deal about expressing protest. You've got to get it out more quickly. But people in the class remembered my doing that for years, because neither they nor I had ever had anything like that happen in a class. And I think it was important for me as a pattern of protest that I followed very often in my life.
And the literature of rebellion and of protest that you favored tended to speak to that.
That's right.
The sense of unfairness in the social system.
That's exactly right.
Was Thoreau one of your favorite authors?
Who?
Thoreau?
No.
Henry David Thoreau?
No.
Oh, Mark Twain?
Yes, certainly Mark Twain. Certainly Mark Twain. Anything he wrote.
There's so much in your cogent wit and wonderful sense of fair play that reminds me of Mark Twain, actually.
Well, that's very nice of you to form such an association.
Well,
Okay.
maybe we'll get. Could you? Do you want to? Or I think maybe we should stop here. Do you want to add, just for our friend here, a couple more lines about the music that you grew up with on 55th Street, 63rd?
Oh, yes. Well, 55th and 63rd Street were wonderful streets, especially 63rd. 63rd was considered the second most important commercial area next to downtown. It just was a tremendously active commercial area. I heard John Coltrane play there in a bar, and I'm sure there were lots of others. Coltrane was the only one that I heard, because I wasn't following jazz much, or his music much. But there were dance halls on 63rd Street, and bars, and 55th Street was principally just a business street. But there was a good bar on 55th also, with first-rate musicians at 55th and Harper. I forget the name of it. But it was awfully good.
55th and Harper?
Yeah.
North side or south side?
I don't know the north side of 55th. But it was very good. And that lively life just disappeared. 63rd Street disappeared by itself. 55th Street had its vitality destroyed by urban renewal, but it would have declined tremendously by itself as time went on. They were both exciting streets to visit and walk up and down.
Do you want to ask another? Well, we've kept you way past the promised time, Mr. Dupre, so I just want to thank you again for being so generous and talking with us. It's absolutely fascinating, and I wish you all of the best for the future.
Thank you.
I'll be hoping to keep that voice going in Hyde Park until the 2016 Olympics and beyond.
Yeah. That's right. Well, the best would be if Chicago doesn't get the Olympics.
I agree with you.
Yeah, they're awful.
Yes.